Half of all cars on the world's roads bore his trademark. Fortune magazine named him, quote, businessman of the century. And yet, his enormous company was never audited. Revenues and expenses were estimated by weighing invoices on a scale. A farm boy who one day walked away to the city, never to return to the plow. How far can a man go who cannot read technical drawings but can see the future? Our subject is Henry Ford. To understand this man, we must go back to the very beginning, to a farm in Michigan, where a 12-year-old boy received a pocket watch as a gift and saw an entire world inside it. A 12-year-old farmer's son sits at a wooden table, turning a pocket watch over in his fingers, a round metal chronograph with a cover on a chain. His father gave it to him a few minutes ago, probably thinking the boy would learn punctuality and get up at dawn without complaint. But the farmer's son does something entirely different. He removes the cover, then carefully takes the mechanism apart. 130 small components lie before him on the tabletop. Gear wheels, springs, ruby bearings, shafts, and levers. Each is useless on its own, but assembled together they form a precise organism that measures time without any human assistance. The boy looks at these parts and sees something more than a watch. He sees the principle by which the entire world operates. One gear sets another in motion, and every mechanism needs a mechanic to start it. He reassembles the watch in a matter of minutes. Soon, neighbors will begin bringing him their broken watches, and he will repair them, earning his first reputation and his first small coins. But in that moment, at the kitchen table, he does not yet know that this gift has just set the direction for his entire life. It was July 30th, 1863, when Henry Ford was born in a small community in Michigan on a farm near Dearborn, the firstborn son of William and Mary Ford. His father's family descended from Irish immigrants who had come to America in search of a better life and found it on the fertile plains of the Midwest. William Ford was a prosperous farmer by local standards, owning a sizable acreage and a cattle herd. Nothing suggested that his eldest son would choose any path other than the one trodden by generations of neighboring farmers. Take over the land, work it, pass it on to the next generation. America in the 1860s was just emerging from the trauma of the Civil War. Reconstruction continued in the South, while industrial power was being born in the North, but in agricultural Michigan time moved more slowly. Farm work was entirely unmechanized. From dawn to dusk, everything was done by hand, carrying water, feeding animals, cleaning barns, chopping wood, plowing and harvesting. A monotonous, exhausting cycle, repeating day after day, season after season. For most local boys, this was the natural order of the world, requiring no justification. For Henry Ford, it became a prison from which he resolved to escape. The boy hated field work with an intensity that surprised even his parents. His father called him a lazybones and a weakling, not understanding that his son was not so much avoiding effort as seeking a different kind of effort. Even as a small child, Henry tried to improve household tasks, devising simple mechanical solutions to save time and labor. He was not lazy. He was impatient with the pointless repetition of the same movements. Later, looking back on his childhood, he would say that even then he thought many things could be done differently, by some other means. Those words sound simple, but they conceal the essence of a character that refused to accept the world as he found it. The only person in the family who understood this impatience was his mother. Mary Ford, née Littego, came from a family of Belgian immigrants and stood out among farming wives for her sensitivity and open-mindedness. Between her and her eldest son, there formed a bond deeper than ordinary parental closeness. They talked about the boy's dreams, about the mechanisms that fascinated him, about the world beyond the farm's boundaries. Mary was the only person who could enter her son's world of dreams and take it seriously. Her death in 1876, when Henry was just 13, was a blow that changed everything. She died from childbirth complications, a tragedy common in those times, yet every time a devastating one for those left behind. For the 13-year-old boy, the farm suddenly became a place where memories of his mother lurked around every corner. The barn where they played, the kitchen where they talked, the field they walked together. The grief intensified his already considerable aversion to rural life. Instead of seeking comfort in physical work, as his father would have expected, the boy withdrew into the world of mechanisms. He began devouring everything he could find on the subject of engines, magazines, textbooks, technical pamphlets. He even built a simple model steam engine, though he immediately noticed that steam had a serious flaw. The boiler was heavy, required a great deal of water, and needed half an hour to heat up. Around the same time, something happened that completed the picture. During one of his trips to nearby Detroit, 13-year-old Henry saw on the road a vehicle that was not pulled by horses. It was a traction engine, a heavy steam-powered machine on wheels used in agriculture, manufactured by Nichols and Shepard. An engineer had attached a drive chain between the machine's axle and the wheels, creating a primitive self-propelled vehicle. For most passers-by, it was probably an interesting but not very practical sight. For Henry Ford, it was a moment of revelation, a vehicle without horses. Here was an idea that fused with his fascination with mechanisms and gave it a concrete shape. From that moment on, the boy's dream had a clear outline: to build his own vehicle that would move by itself. William Ford watched his son with growing unease. He saw a boy who, instead of working in the field, took apart every device that fell into his hands and spent hours reading technical magazines. For the Irish farmer who had built a well-running farm through his own hard work, this attitude was incomprehensible and troubling. Father and son spoke the same language, but lived in two different worlds. William saw land, crops, cattle, tangible, certain things. Henry saw gears, pistons, and a future that no one had yet managed to imagine. In 1879, 16-year-old Henry Ford made a decision that in his patriarchal farming family bordered on betrayal. Without saying a word to his father, he packed his modest belongings and walked to Detroit, 9 miles through fields and forests he had known since childhood, but which had nothing more to offer him. It was not an impulse. It was the result of years of growing certainty that his place was among machines, not among stalks of grain. He left behind the farm, his mother's grave, and a father with whom he had never truly communicated. He took with him the skill of repairing watches, an unstoppable curiosity, and the conviction that if 130 parts could measure time without human help, then he, a mechanic, could make the world run better. The Detroit that young Ford reached was not yet the automotive capital of America, but it was already a powerful industrial center, a city of factories, shipyards, and workshops where you could almost physically feel the pulse of the approaching industrial age. For a farm boy who had not even finished secondary school and would spell words incorrectly for the rest of his life, the city was at once a promise and a challenge. He had no money, no connections, no diploma, but he had something no school can teach: the ability to look at a mechanism and immediately understand how it works and what can be improved. Those 130 watch parts laid out on a kitchen table 6 years earlier turned out to be the most important lesson of his life. Now he intended to apply it on a scale no one had yet imagined. Just 1 week passed, 6 days to be precise. That was how long it took workers at the Michigan Car Company Works wagon factory to get rid of the 16-year-old farm boy who had just started working there. He was not fired for laziness or lack of skill. On the contrary, young Henry Ford found faults in mechanisms too quickly, faults that experienced workers spent hours tracking down. Where others were still searching, he already knew. Where others were still trying, he had already finished. Instead of admiration, he aroused envy, and envy on the factory floor translated into something very concrete. The older workers did everything in their power to get rid of the talented newcomer as quickly as possible. Ford lost his first job not because he was too weak, but because he was too good. That paradox accompanied him throughout his entire life. Detroit in the 1880s was a city in a state of feverish transformation. The United States was leaving the era of post-war Reconstruction and entering the period historians would later call the, quote, Gilded Age. In the East, the fortunes of the Rockefellers and Carnegies were rising. In the West, railway lines were being drawn across deserts and prairies, and in the Great Lakes region where Detroit lay, factories were being built to feed America's growing appetite for steel, machines, and progress. The city reeked of chimney smoke and pulsed with the energy of people who believed that in America everyone could start from zero. For a teenager without education, money, or connections, it was at once a paradise and a hell. There was plenty of work, but competition was even greater. After losing his job at the wagon factory, Ford did not collapse, but drew conclusions. He found a place as an apprentice in the Flower Brothers machine shop, where for $2.60 a week, he learned metalworking, machine repair, and engine building. That money was not even enough for a room and food, so in the evenings, after a full day of heavy physical work, young Ford would sit at a table in a jewelry shop and repair watches. 6 hours every night, 6 nights a week, for an extra $3. The skill he had acquired as a 12-year-old on the farm was now literally keeping him alive in the big city. 2 employers, 18 hours of work a day, a few hours of sleep. Such was the daily rhythm of a 16-year-old who had resolved never to return to the plow. Despite an exhausting way of life, Ford never stopped learning. Every spare moment he devoted to reading machinery manuals and experimenting with metal scraps. He moved through several more establishments. He worked in a repair shipyard, a wagon repair shop, and finally landed at a company that serviced Westinghouse steam traction engines. That last job proved to be a turning point, not because of the wages, but because of his contact with the machines that had fascinated him since the day he saw the self-propelled steam vehicle outside Detroit. Ford learned to operate and repair portable steam engines so skillfully that local farmers began hiring him to work in their fields. Word of the capable young mechanic spread quickly, and the regional representative of Westinghouse hired him to service and install steam tractors on farms in southern Michigan and Ohio. The irony of the situation could not have escaped him. The machines that were supposed to be his passport to city life were tying him to the countryside again. Instead of working in a factory full of innovation, Ford was driving to remote farms to repair agricultural equipment. But at the same time, these experiences gave him something invaluable: a practical, thorough knowledge of steam engines, with all their strengths and weaknesses. He knew their power, but he also knew their limitations: the weight of the boiler, the need to heat water, the risk of explosion, the slowness of startup. Every repair reinforced his conviction that steam was not the future of transport. The future had to be lighter, faster, and simpler. He just did not yet know exactly what it would look like. In 1882, after 3 years of learning and working in Detroit, 19-year-old Ford felt he had learned everything the city could offer him at that point. He was also simply tired and homesick. He returned to his father's farm in Springwells, but not to plow the land. He did as little field work as possible and devoted all his free time to perfecting the Westinghouse portable steam engine his father had recently purchased for mechanizing the harvest. He polished every detail, experimented with settings, and squeezed maximum efficiency from the machine. William Ford watched this with a mixture of irritation and helplessness. His son had come back, but had not really returned. In body, he was on the farm. In spirit, he was somewhere among gears and cylinders. It was then that William Ford made one last attempt to keep his son tied to the land. He gave him 40 acres of ground, a generous gift, in those days a solid start in adult life. But he imposed one condition: Henry must abandon his dreams of machines and never again utter the word automobile. Young Ford accepted his father's terms. He settled on the gifted land, built a small house, and gave the appearance of a man who had finally made peace with his destiny. But appearances were deceiving. Henry Ford had not the slightest intention of farming. All day long he studied technical magazines and mechanics manuals, and the 40 acres served him not as a field to till, but as a quiet base for his real interests. And it was on that farm, not in the big city, that fate presented him with two discoveries that changed the course of his life. The first was a woman. At a New Year's party in 1885, Henry met Clara Bryant, the daughter of a local farmer, 2 years his junior. She was a friend of his sister Mary, and at first showed no particular interest in the shy mechanic, who, instead of talking about harvests and the weather, spoke of springs and gear wheels. Ford won her heart in a manner very typical of him. He showed her a watch he had built himself. They married in 1888 and settled on those same 40 acres that were supposed to be the grave of his ambitions, but became their cradle. Clara proved to be the partner he needed, not only a wife, but a confidant, advisor, and unwavering ally. She believed in his ideas even when he himself was ready to give up. She listened to his proposals, even the strangest ones, never ridiculed them, and never interfered in his decisions. Later, already a rich and famous man, Ford would say that Clara was the one reason he had never broken down. They spent 60 years together. The second discovery, also made on the farm, was the internal combustion engine. Ford came across information about it in one of his technical magazines. He learned that a German engineer, Nicholas August Otto, was producing in small quantities an engine of an entirely new type. Unlike the steam engine, in which combustion took place outside, in a boiler full of water, here combustion occurred inside the cylinder, ignited by an electric spark. The Otto engine needed no heavy boiler and no enormous quantities of water. It was lighter, started almost instantly, and offered a power-to-weight ratio that steam engineers could only dream of. For Ford, who had spent years repairing steam engines and knew their flaws intimately, this information was like a thunderbolt. Here was the solution to the problem that had tormented him for years, an engine light and compact enough to power a personal vehicle, not just a heavy agricultural machine. Ford now knew what he was looking for, but he did not yet understand how it worked. The principle of internal combustion was new and complicated to him. Magazines were not enough. He needed to see such an engine with his own eyes, touch it, take it apart, and put it back together, just like the watch once upon a time. The 40 acres that were supposed to keep him in the countryside turned out to be only a stopping point. The promise made to his father had long since lost its force. Ford had found on the farm a wife who believed in him, and an idea that gave direction to his ambitions. Now he had to return to Detroit, but this time not as a lost teenager looking for any work he could find, rather as a 26-year-old man with a family, experience, and a goal set for him by a certain German engine and 130 parts of a disassembled watch. A cold October night, 1893. In a cramped, poorly lit workshop on Bagley Avenue in Detroit, a 30-year-old man bends over a makeshift construction of pipes, valves, and wires. For months he has been gathering parts from scrapyards and workshops, assembling them into a device meant to prove one single thing, that he can build an internal combustion engine with his own hands. The construction is primitive, even ugly, but Ford does not care about aesthetics. He cares about a spark. He connects a wire to the household electrical installation, adjusts the fuel supply, and signals to his wife. Clara stands at the kitchen table, just on the other side of the workshop wall, holding a bottle of gasoline in one hand and ready to turn a large regulating screw with the other. It is Christmas Eve, and a turkey is roasting on the stove. Ford shouts through the wall for her to turn the valve. Clara does so. The engine coughs, chokes, falls silent. Ford adjusts something in the mechanism and shouts again. Clara turns. This time the workshop fills with a deafening bang, and immediately afterward with the steady, throaty rumble of a working engine. Exhaust fumes flood the kitchen. The turkey grows cold in the oven, but Henry Ford sees and hears nothing but his engine. He has just achieved what he had dreamed of for 15 years, and yet, from that moment to founding his own company, would take another 7 years. The man who had just built a working internal combustion engine would not immediately plunge into entrepreneurship. This delay seems incomprehensible. Ford is 30. He has a working prototype. He has enthusiasm and a family to support. Logic suggests he should capitalize on his achievement as quickly as possible. But Ford would not do so, and the reasons for this decision run deeper than ordinary caution. Let us go back 2 years. In 1891, 26-year-old Ford returns to Detroit with his wife Clara and the infant they expect in 2 years. This time, he is not a wandering teenager. He is an experienced mechanic with a clearly defined goal. He needs a job that will give him access to modern technology while leaving enough free time for his own experiments. He lands ideally. The Detroit Edison Illuminating Company, Thomas Edison's firm, needs a mechanic to operate a large steam engine and generator supplying electricity to 1,000 homes connected to the Detroit grid. The work is night shifts, which at first seems a disadvantage, but proves to be a blessing. The great steam engine runs steadily through most of the night, and Ford has hours of calm that he devotes to consuming electrical engineering textbooks and experimenting with parts in the factory. Edison's company was not a random place of employment. Thomas Alva Edison was in those years probably the most famous inventor in the world, the man who gave America the light bulb, the phonograph, and the electric power distribution system. For Ford, who had grown up with the conviction that technology could transform ordinary people's lives, Edison embodied everything he himself aspired to. To work in his company meant to be close to the source from which modernity flowed. Ford advanced quickly. His mechanical abilities inspired not envy here, but admiration. First, he took the position of senior mechanic, and soon afterward, in 1893, he received a promotion to chief engineer with a doubled salary, $100 a month. This was a sum permitting a decent life and, more importantly, funding for private experiments. The year 1893 brought Ford 3 breakthrough events in quick succession. In November, his only son, Edsel, came into the world, a child who would become both his pride and the source of painful tensions in the Ford family. Shortly afterward came the promotion to chief engineer, and at the end of the year, on Christmas Eve in the kitchen, the engine at last ran. 3 pillars: family, professional standing, and technological breakthrough fell into place almost simultaneously, as if fate had decided to reward Ford for years of patience with a single generous gesture. But Ford did not hurry. He knew that one working engine in a workshop was not yet a car. He knew, too, that a car in a workshop was not yet a company, and a company without reputation and capital was just another failure waiting its turn. For the next 2.5 years, still working at Edison's firm, Ford perfected his engine, reducing its size, increasing its power, and solving the overheating problem that threatened catastrophic failure. Every free evening and every free night he spent in the workshop behind the house, while Clara, just as on that first Christmas Eve trial, helped without a word of complaint, holding tools, handing over parts, tolerating the smell of exhaust fumes in the kitchen. At last, on a warm, damp night of June 4, 1896, at 1:30 in the morning, Ford pushed out of his workshop the vehicle he had been secretly building for 4 years. He called it the quadricycle: 4 bicycle wheels, a steel frame, a seat, a steering lever, and an internal combustion engine mounted beneath the seat. The construction looked more like a motorized bicycle than a car, but it worked. Ford climbed aboard, pressed the pedal, and moved off through the dark streets of sleeping Detroit. Ahead of him rode his assistant Jim Bishop on a bicycle, warning pedestrians. The quadricycle clattered, lurched, and shook with every stroke of the engine, but it drove, on its own, without horses, without steam, powered by drops of gasoline and the stubbornness of one man. This nocturnal journey made no newspaper. There were no witnesses apart from Clara and a few chance passers-by. And yet it was one of those moments that divide history into before and after. Ford made a few more circuits of the neighborhood in the following days, each time adjusting details and testing the machine's endurance. The quadricycle caused a sensation among passers-by. People would converge to stare at the horseless vehicle, and whenever Ford left it in the street for even a minute, there was always someone who tried to start it. In the end, Ford began carrying a chain and padlocking the quadricycle to lampposts, as one would tether a horse to a post, the first known case of vehicle theft prevention in the history of motoring. Despite the technical success, Ford still did not feel ready to found a company. He needed something more than a working prototype. He needed an authority that would convince investors to entrust their money to him. And fate once again favored him. At the annual conference of electrical engineers in New York, organized by Edison's company, the young designer from Detroit met Thomas Edison himself. Ford told him about his internal combustion engine and the quadricycle. The great inventor listened carefully, then struck the table with his fist and said something Ford remembered for the rest of his life. "Keep working on your machine. If you achieve the goal you have set yourself, I predict a great future for you." These words, spoken by the man Ford admired more than anyone in the world, had a power that no investor could have given. Edison did not give Ford money. He gave him something more precious. He gave him the conviction that he was on the right path. The friendship between Ford and Edison, begun that evening, lasted until the final days of both men. They were more alike than might have seemed. Both had risen from poverty. Both were self-taught. Both believed that technology should serve ordinary people, not only the rich. Edison saw in Ford a younger version of himself, and Ford saw in Edison proof that a man without formal education can change the world. This mutual admiration never weakened, even when both had become unimaginably wealthy and influential. In 1898, Ford sold his quadricycle for $200 to a curious British industrialist who wanted to study it. He immediately put the money toward building an improved version. Selling the prototype was not an act of desperation. It was a calculation. Ford had disposed of an outdated model in order to build a better one, closer to what he carried in his mind, a simple, reliable, gasoline-powered vehicle that an ordinary worker could afford. Now he understood why he had not founded a company right after starting the engine on the kitchen table on Christmas Eve, 1893. The engine had been a beginning, not a goal. The quadricycle had been proof of concept, not a product. And Edison's words had been fuel, but not capital. Ford had needed every one of those 7 years to travel the road from mechanic, with an idea to engineer, with a vision, a reputation, and a project ready for production. He knew that one rash decision could destroy everything. The next time he stood before investors, he intended to have an answer to every question. That this caution would prove insufficient, and that failure still awaited him that he had not yet suspected. $1,000. That was how much Henry Ford had the day the shareholders of the Detroit Automobile Company showed him the door, a company he himself had founded, to which he had given 2 years of his life, and in which he had placed his hope of realizing his great dream. Behind him lay months of frustration, quarrels with investors, and 20 cars, when he had promised hundreds. Before him, nothing. No plan, no workshop, no allies. Only his wife Clara, 6-year-old son Edsel, and a conviction, which in anyone else's mouth would have sounded like a symptom of madness, that everything that had just happened was not an end, but a beginning. The fact was that Henry Ford could not build companies. He could build cars. That difference, apparently subtle, proved devastating. The Detroit Automobile Company was founded in August 1899 with great fanfare and the backing of influential figures. Among the 12 investors who contributed $15,000 of starting capital was even the mayor of Detroit, William Mabry. Ford held the position of chief designer with full technical freedom. The problem was that full technical freedom in the hands of a perfectionist means production paralysis. Ford could not declare any design finished. Every model required one more correction, one more test, one more modification. Investors wanted finished vehicles for sale. Ford wanted perfect vehicles. These two goals proved irreconcilable. America at the end of the 19th century was witnessing the birth of the motor industry. Across the country, a dozen small companies were attempting to manufacture automobiles, but the word itself had not yet entered common usage. People spoke of horseless carriages, delivery wagons, or simply machines. These vehicles were expensive, temperamental, and impractical. They served mainly as toys for wealthy eccentrics, while ordinary people regarded them with a mixture of curiosity and irritation. They were noisy, smelly, frightened horses, and inspired the widespread conviction that this was a passing fashion soon to be forgotten. In such a market, a company had either to produce and sell quickly to wealthy clients or die. Ford wanted a third option. He wanted to produce cheap cars for ordinary people, but in 1899, no one believed that ordinary people would ever want to buy a car. The conflict between Ford and the board grew for many months. Shareholders saw in the young designer a talented engineer who completely failed to understand the rules of business. Ford saw in the shareholders people devoid of imagination, who wanted to sell expensive carriages to wealthy snobs instead of changing the world. In 2 years of the company's existence, just 20 vehicles had come off the production line, a pitiful number even by the standards of the time. Component suppliers let him down, because Ford depended on outside subcontractors and did not control the supply chain. The factory stood idle, waiting for overdue component deliveries. Money was running out, and there were virtually no revenues from sales. When the shareholders finally removed Ford from his position, he was 37 years old, with $1,000 in his pocket, and a reputation as a man who could build an engine but could not run a business. Ford left the company with one resolution. Never again would he occupy a dependent position. Never again would he let others decide the direction of his work. That resolution sounded proud, but in practice it meant that a man without capital and without a company was promising himself complete independence. Ford relieved the irony of the situation in his own way. He believed in reincarnation and treated every failure like a death and a rebirth in which one carries forward experience from the previous life. Humiliating is not failure itself, but the fear of it, he repeated to himself and others. Whether this was naive magical thinking or an effective psychological strategy is hard to determine. One thing is certain. Where another man would have seen reason for despair, Ford saw material for learning. And it was in that lowest moment that Ford made a turn that proved to be a stroke of genius. Instead of looking for new investors for another automobile company, he directed all his energy toward racing. His reasoning was simple. Races attract crowds. Crowds generate publicity. And publicity is the currency with which you can buy investors, confidence. He built a light two-cylinder racing car, producing 26 horsepower, modest by racing standards, but Ford had wagered not on power but on low weight. His competitors, heavy cars, had the advantage in horsepower. Ford had the advantage in kilograms. It was the same engineering instinct that had led him to reject heavy steam engines in favor of light internal combustion engines, seeking simplicity where others sought power. On October 10, 1901, at the Detroit Driving Club track, a race took place that changed Ford's life. His rival was Alexander Winton, a legendary designer from Cleveland, owner of one of the largest automotive companies in the country, driving a powerful, multi-cylinder racing car piloted by the best professional driver in America. Ford started alone, in a car of his own design, without a team of mechanics, without racing experience, without any chance in the eyes of the public. The race consisted of 10 laps, and at first Winton led by an enormous margin. But his heavy machine began to overheat, losing power with every lap. Ford's lighter car ran steadily, without losses, gradually closing the gap. In the final laps, Ford overtook Winton and crossed the finish line first. The crowd went wild. The next day, newspapers across the country reported the victory of the unknown mechanic over a motoring legend. That one race gave Ford more than 2 years of running a company. It gave him what no workshop or office could have provided: public fame. Suddenly, Henry Ford was a name that meant something. Investors who had refused to meet him now sought contact themselves. Among them were people who had only recently lost money in the Detroit Automobile Company, including Mayor Murphy and coal magnate Alexander Malcolmson. They believed, again, that Ford had a talent that could be turned to profit. In November 1901, the Henry Ford Company was established. The second company, bearing his name, directly or indirectly. And here, history repeated itself with painful precision. Investors in the Henry Ford Company expected the production of light, urban personal cars, vehicles that could quickly be sold to wealthy clients. Ford, however, intoxicated by his racing success, wanted to keep building racing cars. Racing had brought him fame, and he was convinced that further victories would bring even more. He allocated company money to developing racing cars instead of manufacturing everyday vehicles. The board, having already lived through the Detroit Automobile Company disaster, was not prepared to wait for a repeat. They replaced Ford as chief engineer, substituting Henry Leland, a fine mechanic who would soon lead the company to great success, but under an entirely different name. The Henry Ford Company was renamed the Cadillac Motor Company. Ford left for the second time, leaving behind a company that without him would become one of the most prestigious luxury marques in the history of motoring. 2 enterprises, 2 failures, and after his departure from the second, the Cadillac emerged, renamed by Henry Leland. In both cases, Ford proved too stubborn, too visionary, and too little pragmatic to maintain himself in a structure he did not fully control. But those same qualities that made him an impossible partner also made him indomitable. Ford did not give up after the first failure and did not give up after the second. He continued working on racing cars and in 1901 built a powerful 80-horsepower car called the Ford 999, and 2 years later, his next design broke America's speed record, reaching 90 kilometers per hour. Every victory built the legend. Every legend attracted new investors, and every new investor gave Ford another chance at what he had not managed to achieve the first or second time. Failure is only the opportunity to begin again, this time more intelligently, Ford said years later, and those words were not an empty phrase, they were an autobiography. 5 weeks. That was how long Ford Motor Company survived before the world tried to destroy it. On June 16, 1903, Henry Ford registered his third company, and already by the end of July, the Association of Licensed Automobile Manufacturers had refused him a license to manufacture vehicles with internal combustion engines. The refusal meant that every car leaving Ford's factory was illegal, every buyer was exposed to legal action, and Ford himself risked imprisonment. The man who had lost his own company twice had just founded a third, and before he had managed to produce a single car, the law stood in his way. The history of this conflict reached back to 1895, when New York businessman George Selden obtained a patent for a vehicle powered by an internal combustion engine. Selden was not an inventor in the strict sense of the word. He had not built any working automobile, had not designed any engine, had not carried out any successful test drive. He was a lawyer who had understood the potential of the new technology and secured rights to it on paper. His patent described a car in such general and schematic terms that practically any vehicle with an internal combustion engine could be deemed to violate it. The technical drawing was primitive, the construction description deliberately blurred. Selden did not want to build cars. He wanted to collect fees from everyone who did. On that basis, the Association of Licensed Automobile Manufacturers was formed, an organization comprising the largest manufacturers who had bought licenses from Selden and paid him royalties on every vehicle sold. In return, they received legal protection and, more importantly, the ability to eliminate competition. Any manufacturer who did not belong to the association could be buried in lawsuits and forced to shut down. The system was simple and ruthless. Either you pay Selden and join the club, or you are destroyed. Most manufacturers chose the first option. Ford chose a third to fight. This decision was risky to the point of madness. Ford Motor Company was founded with capital of just $28,000, a laughably small sum even by the standards of the time. The money was put in by people who believed in Ford despite his 2 earlier failures: the faithful Alexander Malcolmson, brothers John and Horace Dodge, Malcolmson's uncle, his secretary, and 2 lawyers. Ford was 40 years old, had 2 bankruptcies to his name, and a patent that forbade him from doing precisely what he intended to do. A rational man would have sought a compromise. Ford was not a rational man. He was a man with a mission. "I will build a car for the great multitude," Ford told his investors. "It will be large enough for the family, but small enough for one person to drive and maintain. It will be built of the best materials, by the best people, according to the simplest design that modern engineering can devise. And its price will be so low that every man earning a decent wage will be able to own one." Those words sounded like a manifesto, but in 1903 they were above all a promise made to a handful of people who had risked their savings. Ford knew that this time he could not afford the perfectionism that had buried his two previous companies. He had to produce and sell quickly, in volume, and cheaply. And indeed, the third company proved different. Ford had drawn lessons from the previous defeats with ruthless systematism. He controlled component supplies, avoiding the stoppages that had killed his first company. He delegated tasks to engineers, avoiding the perfectionist paralysis that had killed the second. And he did not yield to investors, fighting for the right to build cheap cars for ordinary people rather than expensive toys for the wealthy. Model A, the first car sold by Ford Motor Company, went to a Chicago dentist in 1903. It was a two-seat vehicle producing 8 horsepower, weighing 550 kilograms, with a top speed of 45 kilometers per hour. In under a year, more than 500 had been sold. Ford had proved he could not only build, but sell. But throughout this time, the sword of Damocles of the Selden patent hung over the company. The association had no intention of letting up. The trial began and dragged on, month after month, year after year. Ford's rivals spread rumors that anyone who bought a car without the association's license would be held liable. "Buying a Ford means a lawsuit," was whispered in drawing rooms and in the papers. Some potential customers did indeed withdraw, frightened by the prospect of a legal battle. Ford responded in a way that for the first time revealed his genius not only as an engineer, but as a marketer. He published an extensive statement in the press, in which he explained the details of the dispute and publicly committed to protecting every Ford car buyer from any legal claims. He established a guarantee fund of $12 million to cover any court costs incurred by customers. The number of people who actually applied for compensation did not exceed 5. Sales, meanwhile, rose. People saw in Ford a man who stood up to the powerful and defended the ordinary citizen. The first verdict, in 1909, went against Ford. The court upheld the Selden patent and ordered Ford to cease production. This ruling could have meant the end of Ford Motor Company, but Ford did not submit. He filed an appeal and continued production, risking serious legal consequences. For the next 2 years, the factory worked under the shadow of the judgment, while Ford simultaneously waged a legal war and a war for customers. Finally, in 1911, the Court of Appeals delivered a landmark verdict. It ruled that the Selden patent applied only to one specific type of engine, and that the construction used by Ford was sufficiently different that it did not infringe the patent. The monopoly was broken. The significance of this ruling extended far beyond the interests of one company. Ford's victory lowered the barrier of entry to the automotive market for dozens of other manufacturers who until then had either been paying royalties to the association or had not undertaken the risk of production at all. Ford became a hero not only in the eyes of consumers, but in the eyes of smaller businessmen for whom the Selden monopoly had been an insurmountable barrier. People forgot about Ford's 2 earlier failures. They now saw in him the man who had defeated Goliath. And simultaneously, and this was a paradox Ford would wrestle with for the rest of his life, the greater his success grew, the sharper the criticism in the press became. Newspapers that had recently described his victories began looking for dark sides, controversies, grounds for attack. Ford was not the type to let criticism pass without a second thought. He felt every attack personally and remembered every one. But in those years, at the beginning of the second decade of the 20th century, the negative articles were merely an irritating background noise compared with what was happening in the factory. Ford Motor Company was growing at a breathtaking pace. In the 8 years since its founding, the company had worked through the entire alphabet of models from A to S, refining each successive design, cutting costs, and increasing production volume. Ford controlled supplies, avoiding the stoppages that had killed his first company. He delegated to engineers, avoiding the perfectionist paralysis that had killed the second. And he did not yield to investors, fighting for the right to build cheap cars for ordinary people, rather than expensive toys for the wealthy. The hardest thing in the world is to think with one's own head. That is why I so seldom meet people who take advantage of this possibility, Ford said in those years. 8 years of working through the alphabet of models led to one thing, the letter T, which was about to change everything. The year 1904, Chicago, the Stockyards District. Henry Ford stands on a metal gallery above the slaughterhouse floor and looks down. Below him, on steel rails, beef carcasses slowly, steadily move past, one after another. At each station stands a butcher who performs one single operation. One cuts the hide, the next removes the innards, the next divides the carcass into parts. None of them needs to know about the whole process. Each knows only his own movement, repeated hundreds of times a day with surgical precision. The entire operation takes minutes, where once it took hours. Ford stands on that gallery and does not see meat. He sees a car. He sees how, instead of breaking down carcasses into parts, one can assemble a car from parts in the reverse direction, but according to the same principle. One worker, one operation, a moving line. This vision seems obvious from a 21st century perspective, but in 1904 it was something unheard of. Cars throughout the world were built as they had always been built, by craftsmen, one at a time, slowly. Skilled mechanics would gather around a stationary chassis, like surgeons around a patient, each performing dozens of different operations. A single worker needed 12.5 hours to assemble one chassis. If one man assembled the engine, it took him nearly 10 hours. A car was a luxury product, not only because of its materials or technology. It was luxurious because its manufacture consumed enormous quantities of highly skilled human labor. Ford intended to change this, but the road from the vision on the slaughterhouse gallery to a working production system proved longer and more difficult than he had expected. First, however, he needed a car suited to mass production. Over the 4 years following his visit to Chicago, Ford's factory passed through successive models of the alphabet, each one a step closer to the ideal: simple, durable, cheap to produce, easy to operate. Finally, on October 1, 1908, a car rolled off the assembly line for which Ford had worked his entire life, the Model T. It was equipped with a 4-cylinder, 3-liter engine, a planetary gearbox providing smooth gear changes, and suspension on 2 semi-elliptical springs that handled the appalling state of American roads. The steering wheel was placed on the left side, a solution that all manufacturers in the world would soon copy. The engine and gearbox were completely enclosed, protecting them from dust and mud. The price was $850, at least 20% less than the cheapest competing model on the market. The market's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within a few weeks of the Model T's presentation, the company received 25,000 orders. The problem was that in 1909, Ford managed to produce only 17,000 cars. Demand far outstripped supply, and Ford was perfectly aware that traditional production methods would never allow him to satisfy the market's hunger. Every customer can choose whatever color they want, provided it is black, Ford joked, and in that joke lay an iron logic. One color, one version, identical spare parts. This was the foundation on which he intended to build something the world had never seen. In 1910, Ford built a vast factory in Highland Park outside Detroit, a complex design from the ground up for mass production. It was here that he finally brought to life the idea born on the gallery of the Chicago slaughterhouse. The process worked as follows. A Model T chassis started at the beginning of the assembly line and moved slowly through successive workstations. At each station stood a worker performing 1 or 2 simple operations: bolting on a wheel, fitting a suspension arm, connecting a wire. He did not need to know how to build an entire car. He needed to master only his own fragment. Brilliant machines pressed identical body and chassis components and fed them directly onto the assembly line, eliminating stoppages and errors resulting from manual processing. The results were staggering. Assembly time for a chassis fell from 12.5 hours to just 93 minutes. Factory output increased fivefold in the first year. Ford immediately hired 300 new workers and could choose from among unskilled laborers because the assembly line required no special skills. All that was needed were capable hands and the willingness to repeat the same movement thousands of times a day. Every Model T that rolled off the line was identical, the same color, the same parts, the same quality. Standardization, which in the craftsman's world is considered a flaw, proved in the world of mass production to be its greatest advantage. Spare parts fitted every example, repairs were simple and cheap, and production costs fell with every vehicle produced. Ford did not stop at assembly alone. Central to his vision was control of the entire production chain, from raw material to finished car. He built factories producing every component of the vehicle, from steel to glass to tires. This unprecedented coordination allowed cost reduction at every stage and eliminated dependence on outside suppliers, which had killed his first company. Ford remembered the lessons of the Detroit Automobile Company, a factory standing idle waiting for overdue component deliveries. This time, no one was to have the power to stop him. The numbers grew at a pace that contemporary observers deemed improbable. In 1909, Ford produced 17,000 cars. In 1910, more than 30,000. In 1912, to 68,000. In 1914, more than 300,000. More than all other American manufacturers combined. Every year he doubled production and simultaneously reduced the price. The Model T that cost $850 in 1908 was available for under $400 in 1916. In 1917, the price fell to $350. The formula was simple and merciless. More cars means lower unit costs. Lower costs means a lower price. A lower price means more customers. More customers means still more cars. The wheel turned, and Ford drove it with obsessive determination. By 1916, the 500,000th Model T had rolled out of Ford's factories, a record that stood for 45 years. Half of all cars on the world's roads bore Ford's oval emblem. The car that only a few years earlier had been a toy for the rich had become the everyday tool of millions of ordinary families. Farmers drove Fords to market, doctors to patients, postmen on their routes, families on Sunday outings. The Model T did not only change the way people traveled, it changed the very shape of American life. Suburbs began to spread, because people could live far from their place of work. Roads began to improve, because there were now people for whom to build them. Gas stations, motels, roadside restaurants, an entire infrastructure burst from state budgets and sprang up along the highways on which millions of black Fords traveled. Ford himself watched all this with satisfaction, but also with a certain ideological obstinacy. He considered the Model T a perfect car, the only one that humanity would ever need. He refused to introduce stylistic changes, rejected proposals for new colors and versions of equipment. A car should be a tool, not an ornament. Function, not form. Simplicity, not luxury. In this vision lay both Ford's strength and his future weakness. The same unyieldingness that allowed him to build an empire would one day bring him to the moment when the market would turn away from him. But in 1916, that moment was still far away. For now, Henry Ford was the man who had taken the process of breaking down beef carcasses, reversed it, and built upon it a machine capable of producing 500,000 cars a year, and then cut their price by more than half so that everyone could buy one. January 5, 1914. Henry Ford summoned journalists to his office in Highland Park and announced something that sounded like a joke or the prelude to bankruptcy. From this day forward, the minimum daily wage for a worker in Ford Motor Company's factories is $5. The journalists looked at one another, convinced they had misheard. The prevailing wage in American industry at that time was around $2.30 for a 10-hour working day. Ford was not merely doubling that rate. He was doing so while simultaneously shortening the working day to 8 hours. The following day, the news reached front pages across the country. The Wall Street Journal called the decision an economic crime. Other businessmen thundered that Ford had gone mad, that he would overturn the entire system, that $5 a day for physical labor was a signal of the end of American capitalism. Before the gates of the Highland Park factory, the very next morning, a queue of 10,000 job seekers had formed. In the January frost, police had to use fire hoses to disperse the crowd. Ford's decision was not, contrary to widespread belief, an act of philanthropy. It was an act of cool calculation dressed in the garb of nobility. To understand what drove him to this step, we must go back a few months and look at the dark side of the Model T's success. The assembly line that revolutionized efficiency had simultaneously turned factory work into a hell of repetition. A worker who for 8, 10, or 12 hours a day performed one and the same movement, tightening the same bolt, fitting the same suspension arm, connecting the same wire, lost not only physical strength, but mental health. People began seeing the assembly line in their dreams. Some left without a word after a few weeks. Staff turnover reached a level that threatened the very principle of the factory's operation. To keep 100 workers in position, Ford had to hire 1,000 new people over the course of a year. Every departure meant training costs, stoppages, and lost efficiency. The line could only function when all workers were at their stations. One unstaffed position paralyzed the whole line. $5 a day solved the problem immediately and dramatically. Suddenly, working in Ford's factory became the most sought-after manual job in America. Turnover fell from nearly 100% to a few percent. The best workers from across the country converged on Detroit, and Ford could pick and choose. But the benefits did not stop there. A second, less obvious consequence was equally significant. Ford's workers, earning $5 a day, were becoming potential Ford customers. The Model T cost around $450 at the time, meaning that a mechanic on the assembly line could save up for his own car in a matter of months. Ford had understood something that escaped most of his rivals. Mass production requires mass consumption, and mass consumption requires people who can afford to buy. Low wages will ruin a business far sooner than they will ruin the worker, he said. And those words became one of the most frequently cited sentences in the history of American business. Investors did not share his enthusiasm. $5 a day meant additional costs for Ford Motor Company of $5 to $6 million a year, money that in their view ought to go to shareholders as dividends. Particularly vocal in their protests were the Dodge brothers, John and Horace, who were not only shareholders but also component suppliers for Ford Motor Company. The brothers saw in Ford a man giving away their money. They demanded a return to the old rates and the payment of overdue dividends. Ford refused with characteristic firmness. "A company that pays poorly is always unstable," he replied. The matter went to court. Ford won, and this only strengthened his position. But Ford went still further. He introduced profit sharing for his workers. At the end of each year, every employee could receive a share of the company's profit, the amount depending on length of service and, significantly, on leading a proper way of life. For 1 year of service, 5% of a worker's annual income was paid. For 2 years, 7.5%. For 3, 10%. He shortened the working day from 10 to 8 hours and divided the day into 3 shifts, allowing the factory to operate without interruption for 24 hours. He introduced breaks during a shift, something previously unknown. At the prompting of his wife Clara, he reduced the working week from 6 to 5 days, thereby creating something that today seems obvious but was then revolutionary, the 2-day weekend. It was in Ford's factories that the modern Sunday, as a day of rest for everyone, not only the wealthy, was born. Workers sometimes called him benefactor and sometimes tyrant. and both names were deserved. For all these benefits, Ford demanded absolute obedience. He created in the factory what he called the sociological department, a group of inspectors whose task was to check whether workers were leading an appropriate life outside the workplace. Inspectors visited employees' homes, spoke with their wives and neighbors. They checked whether anyone was drinking alcohol, gambling, neglecting their family, failing to pay child support, or causing disturbances at home. Those who did not meet the standards lost the right to profit sharing and bonuses. The penalty for drinking could cost a worker several $100s a year. The penalty for neglecting children even more. The inspections penetrated privacy as deeply as no American employer had previously dared. And yet workers accepted these conditions because the alternative was work at $2 a day elsewhere without any supervision, but also without any hope. In the factory itself, rules were equally strict. Ford forbade any unnecessary movements, stooping, or conversation among workers. He did not tolerate smoking or obesity. He once even dismissed an engineer with instructions to return when he had lost 20 kilograms. He practically did not employ women, believing their place was in the home. But on the other hand, unlike most employers of his time, he did employ people with disabilities. He believed that those with disabilities should not be a burden on society but should be useful, and on the assembly line were people with one arm, the deaf, the blind, and those who had had amputations. Each was assigned a task they could perform, and each received the same rate of pay as everyone else. Ford called his approach Fordism and considered it a social model for all of America. In his vision, the future belonged to people who worked hard, lived modestly, saved money, and bought things that would help them. For example, a Ford car. He considered trade unions an evil. He preferred to decide himself what was good for the worker. To guard against attempts by workers to organize, he established the Service Department, a group of men under the command of former Navy boxer Harry Bennett, whose task was to intimidate those who tried to agitate for unions. Bennett's men could be brutal. Some years later, when unions finally broke into Ford's factories, the bills for these brutal methods would be presented in the form of bloody clashes in the streets of Dearborn. But in those years, in the second half of the second decade of the 20th century, the contradictions of Fordism were less visible than its successes. Ford had become wealthy beyond imagining and equally popular, loved by ordinary people, hated by the financial elites who could not forgive him for doing things his own way. The conflict with the Dodge brothers sharpened to the point where, in 1919, the brothers sued Ford for failure to pay dividends and abuse of power. The court ruled in their favor and ordered Ford to pay multi-million-dollar damages. Ford paid without blinking, and then, in a move that shook Wall Street, bought back nearly all the Ford Motor Company shares held by outside investors. He paid more than $125 million in the money of the time, equivalent today to nearly $700 million. From that moment, Ford Motor Company was 100% owned by the Ford family. Henry Ford had become the sole master of his empire. No one could tell him any longer that he was giving away other people's money. Now he was giving away his own, and he intended to give it away exactly as he himself saw fit. November 15, 1915, the port of Hoboken, New Jersey. At the quayside lies a great transatlantic liner, the Oscar II, and boarding her is a group of several dozen people, pacifists, journalists, students, pastors, and social activists. At the head of this peculiar expedition stands Henry Ford, the wealthiest industrialist in America, the man who has just decided to end the war in Europe on his own. On the quayside, a crowd of spectators has gathered. Ford waves from the deck to journalists and announces his goals in a manner that will fill all American newspapers the next day. "We want to get the boys out of the trenches before Christmas," he says. Friends ask whether he really believes he can achieve this. Ford answers without hesitation. The ship pushes off from the quay. One of the most peculiar diplomatic missions of the 20th century begins. Led by a man who had never in his life dealt with politics, knew no foreign languages, and had no mandate to represent anyone. To understand how the son of a Michigan farmer found himself on a transatlantic liner sailing on a peace mission to Europe, we must go back a year. The First World War broke out in August 1914, and from the beginning, Ford watched it with mounting horror. Raised in a Christian Protestant milieu in the American Midwest, he lived in the conviction that war was the greatest waste of human energy and the greatest crime a civilized society could commit. His pacifist views were not a pose. They were a deep conviction rooted both in religion and in his own philosophy of technology. Ford believed that machines should free people from heavy labor, not serve to kill them. On hearing that the Western fronts were consuming tens of thousands of lives each day, he felt not only moral outrage, but personal responsibility. Pacifist America of 1915 was considerably louder than the America of the 21st century. President Woodrow Wilson was conducting his campaign under the banner of maintaining neutrality. A significant portion of the public wanted no involvement in the European conflict, and pacifist movements were gathering support across the country. Among their activists was Hungarian writer and feminist Rosika Schwimmer, who had come to America to campaign for an end to the war. It was she who in November 1915 reached Ford and presented him with an idea so bold it bordered on the absurd, a private peace mission that would persuade European leaders to begin negotiations. Ford, usually suspicious of strangers, this time allowed himself to be convinced in just 2 hours. Schwimmer had hit a sensitive point. She promised that the boys would come home from the front by Christmas. And for Ford, who was the father of an only son and a deeply believing man, that promise carried the power of a religious revelation. Ford decided to act quickly. At his own expense, he chartered an entire ship, the Oscar II, and invited on board everyone who wished to support the peace mission. He tried to draw President Wilson into the enterprise, but the president politely declined, deeming the whole affair quixotic. Ford also wrote to his friend Thomas Edison, hoping for his presence as a symbolic gesture of support. Edison, despite his deep respect for Ford, also declined. The great inventor knew the realities of international politics too well to take part in something he considered doomed to failure. None of these refusals discouraged Ford. On the contrary, they reinforced in him the sense that he was doing something important that others lacked the courage to undertake. America of 1915 looked upon Ford as a hero who had finally dared to do something concrete for peace. But the press, which had recently been praising him, quickly changed its tone. Journalists saw in the expedition excellent material for satire. They called the Oscar II the ship of fools, the ship of Detroit dreamers, the pacifist ark. More than 150 people boarded, including 36 journalists who described every detail of the voyage with merciless precision. And there was no shortage of details to describe before the ship had even reached Europe. Ideological arguments broke out among the pacifists. Some wanted to negotiate with the Germans, others with the French. Still, others wanted to appeal to the neutral governments of Scandinavia. Ford, who had never enjoyed long discussions, quickly tired of the quarrels. He came down with the flu, shut himself in his cabin, and spent most of the voyage in bed. When the Oscar II reached Norway after 3 weeks at sea, Ford was not only physically ill, but also politically disillusioned. He understood that European leaders would not treat the private initiative of an American industrialist as a serious diplomatic offer. He landed in Christiania, present-day Oslo, and after a few days decided to return immediately to the United States. The rest of the delegation continued fruitless talks in several neutral countries for the following weeks. But without its founder and patron, the whole mission had lost its weight. European and American newspapers gloated over the failure with great satisfaction. Detroit dreamer, they wrote of Ford, the billionaire who wanted to buy peace, the pacifist who doesn't understand politics. Ford himself returned to America with mixed feelings. On the one hand, he realized he had suffered a public defeat. On the other, he retained a deep conviction that he had done what ought to have been done. Humiliating is not failure itself, but the fear of it. That principle of his proved useful once again. Ford treated the peace mission as he treated the bankruptcies of his first automobile companies, as an experience from which lessons must be drawn, not a tragedy that ought to break him. Curiously, American public opinion, contrary to the press mockery, largely considered Ford's intentions to have been noble. Ordinary people saw in him a man who had had the courage to risk his own money and his own reputation in the name of peace. That paradox, mocked by the elites and loved by the masses, became from that point onward a constant feature of his public image. 2 years after the voyage of the Oscar II, the United States itself entered the war. In April 1917, President Wilson announced mobilization, and the American economy switched to a war footing. Ford, a pacifist by conviction, faced a dilemma that he resolved in a surprisingly pragmatic manner. He concluded that since his country had entered the war, his duty as a citizen was to help win it. Ford's factories were immediately converted to war production. They manufactured Liberty aircraft engines, motorboats for use against German submarines, military vehicles, gas masks, and toward the end of the war, even light tanks. The man who had only recently sailed to Europe to stop the war was now making millions from it. Ford claimed he was returning all profits from military equipment sales to the government, but the actual accounts were never fully disclosed. Moreover, the market value of his empire grew many times over during the war, and Ford Motor Company's position as a strategic government supplier became unassailable. The failure of the peace mission paradoxically strengthened Ford's ambitions. Since the world would not listen to him as a private diplomat, he resolved to strengthen his voice politically. In 1918, at the prompting of President Wilson, he agreed to stand for the United States Senate from Michigan. He conducted virtually no campaign and forbade spending his own money on it. He lost by a narrow margin, around 7,000 votes. This defeat only reinforced his conviction that his real battlefield was not politics, but the factory and the publishing house. He soon published a book entitled My Life and Work, which became an international bestseller and was translated into dozens of languages. In Germany, it had a particularly large readership, among them a certain young political agitator from Munich, who hung a portrait of Ford in his office and called the American industrialist his greatest teacher. July 30, 1938, Dearborn, Michigan, Henry Ford's 75th birthday. In a banquet hall, the silver-haired industrialist sits surrounded by family and associates, and before him stand 2 German diplomats in dress uniform. One of them, representing the government of the Third Reich, removes from a velvet case a heavy medal on a silk ribbon, the Grand Cross of the German Eagle Order, the highest decoration that Nazi Germany could award to a foreigner. Before Ford, it had been presented to only a handful of people, including Benito Mussolini. The order is pinned to the lapel of the birthday boy's jacket. Ford smiles and gives thanks. Photographers capture the moment on film that will appear in newspapers around the world the following day. The photographs show an elderly gentleman with a German eagle on his chest, a man who had built the most modern industry in the world, and who had just accepted the highest award from a regime whose ideology represented the negation of everything Western civilization considered its heritage. The road that had brought Ford to this moment had begun much earlier, and had roots deeply embedded in his own biography. Anti-Semitism in the American Midwest of the 1850s and 60s was a widespread phenomenon, embedded in a broader mistrust of banking systems, urban elites, and people perceived as outsiders. Ford grew up in this atmosphere as the eldest son of Irish farmers, for whom New York was as foreign a place as Europe. For most of his life, he kept these prejudices to himself, focusing his energy on building his empire. But when his wealth and influence reached dimensions that allowed him to address the whole world, these dormant convictions began to surface with disturbing force. In 1918, Ford bought a local newspaper in Dearborn and transformed it into a nationally distributed weekly, the Dearborn Independent. Initially, the publication was intended to be a platform for his personal views on economic and social matters, but from 1920, its character changed radically. The paper began running a series of articles under the collective title, The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem. The series ultimately comprised nearly 90 texts, in which the authors held the Jewish community responsible for almost everything Ford considered evil in the modern world. From the outbreak of the First World War to financial crises, the collapse of morals, and the rise of jazz music. The texts themselves were a mixture of primitive stereotypes, conspiracy theories, and deliberately selected fragments, including extensive quotations from the notorious Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fabrication created by the Tsarist secret police, whose inauthenticity had already been established by serious historians. To give the paper maximum reach, Ford instructed all Ford car dealers in the United States to subscribe to the Dearborn Independent and make it freely available to customers. At its peak, the weekly circulation exceeded 700,000 copies, making it one of the most widely read papers in America. The articles from the International Jew series were then published as a book in 4 volumes, and the book was translated into several languages, including German. It was this German translation that fell into the hands of the young political agitator from Munich, who from that point on treated Ford as his personal role model. Adolf Hitler placed a portrait of the American industrialist in his office, and in an interview given to an American journalist in 1931 named Ford as his inspiration. Ford's anti-Semitic campaign met with sharp reaction in the United States. Jewish organizations organized a boycott of Ford cars, and prominent lawyers, including Aaron Shapiro, brought defamation suits against Ford. Social and legal pressure built over several years until in 1927, Ford publicly apologized for the content published in the Dearborn Independent. He declared that he had not known about the nature of the material, that the editors had acted without his knowledge, that he sincerely regretted the harm he had done to the Jewish community. The publication was closed the same year, and the book The International Jew was officially withdrawn from distribution in America. But the German editions were already circulating in Europe with a life of their own, translated, reprinted, cited by the growing nationalist movements over which Ford had no control. The question of how sincere his subsequent apologies were, and how far they were forced by lawsuits and falling sales, remains a matter of historical dispute to this day. Some believe Ford genuinely changed his mind. Others point to his subsequent contacts with Nazi Germany as evidence that the apologies were tactical. Those contacts did indeed continue. In the 1930s, Ford's German subsidiary, Ford Work in Cologne, operated without hindrance under Nazi rule, producing passenger cars, military trucks, and aircraft engines delivered to the Wehrmacht. After Germany's invasion and occupation of France, Ford's factory at Poissy near Paris also continued production for the German army. Simultaneously, Ford's American factories in Detroit were producing B-24 Liberator bombers, tanks, and trucks for the United States Army, fighting that same Wehrmacht. 2 parts of Ford's empire were working on both sides of the front, and the industrialist himself, at least officially, maintained that the German factories operated beyond his control. Historians continue to study how far that explanation corresponded to reality. Documents from Ford Works archives and American investigative agencies allow various hypotheses to be advanced, and a straightforward assessment of this chapter of Ford's biography still eludes simple judgments. Paradoxically, Ford was equally intensively engaged with the Soviet Union, the ideological opposite of Nazi Germany. In 1929, Ford Motor Company signed a contract with the Soviet government for the construction of 2 car factories, one in Nizhny Novgorod, the other in Moscow. The agreement provided that Ford would supervise construction of the Nizhny Novgorod plant and design production of Soviet copies of the Model A, in return for which the Soviet Union undertook to buy 72,000 Ford cars in parts, together with all spare components needed for the following 9 years. The value of the contract was estimated at $30 million in the money of the time. The Soviet passenger car Gaz-A, which rolled off the line in Nizhny Novgorod on January 29, 1932, was a licensed copy of the Ford Model A. Ford, when asked about Stalin, reportedly said that the projects of Peter the Great were nothing compared to the Soviet leader's plans. This statement, cited by various sources in various versions, aptly captures Ford's peculiar indifference to ideology. What counted was industry, machines in large numbers, not the banners under which those machines were to work. To this collection of paradoxes was added yet another, Ford's utopia in the Brazilian jungle, named Fordlandia. At the end of the 1920s, Ford decided to make his factories independent of outside rubber suppliers, purchased millions of hectares of Amazonian forest, and built there an ideal city modeled on the American Midwest, with single-family homes, a school, hospital, cinema, and golf course. Workers were forbidden to drink alcohol, smoke, gamble, or play cards, even in the privacy of their own homes. The tropical climate, disease, worker revolt, and leaf blight on the rubber trees brought the project to a spectacular collapse. Fordlandia became a monument to Ford's unwavering faith that his model of life and work could be transplanted to any place on Earth, and an equally spectacular demonstration that the world is more complicated than it appeared to a man who saw it as a great machine to be set in motion. Early morning in the office of the president of Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, the early 1940s. 80-year-old Henry Ford sits at his desk, and in the inside pocket of his jacket is a revolver. He carries it everywhere, to the factory, on walks through the garden, even to bed. After suffering a stroke, he is prone to attacks of mistrust, bordering on paranoia. He trusts no one, apart from one man, former Navy boxer Harry Bennett, head of his service department. Bennett spends more and more time at the Ford residence, sometimes every day, and family members watch with growing unease as the influence of this tough, unscrupulous man on their patriarch grows month by month. Rumors circulate that Bennett plans to take control of Ford Motor Company after the founder's death, and Ford himself seems to make no attempt to deny them. In the air hangs a question that no one has the courage to answer directly. Is the man who built the greatest industrial empire of the 20th century still capable of running it responsibly? The road to this point had been long and marked by struggles that Ford for decades had been unable to win by his own methods. The 1930s brought to the Detroit factories new forces that Fordism could not handle. The Great Depression deepened workers' frustration, and the union movement, led by Walter Reuther, began organizing workers in the motor industry. General Motors and Chrysler had recognized trade unions as early as 1937, but Ford stubbornly remained the last bastion of resistance. Harry Bennett and his service department men broke up strike rallies with clubs, intimidated organizers, dismissed on disciplinary grounds anyone who so much as whispered about workers' rights. The conflict reached its peak on April 1, 1941, when, in the steel rolling mill worker Andy Dunn quarreled with a foreman and began chanting a single word, taken up throughout the hall: strike. Within hours, the entire River Rouge factory had stopped. Workers refused to work, and Ford was preparing for a long, brutal confrontation. Then, something happened that no one had expected. Clara Ford, Henry's wife and faithful companion for more than half a century, sided with the workers. Throughout her previous life, Clara had avoided interfering in her husband's business decisions. She was his confidant, but never his advisor in factory matters. This time she acted differently. She told him directly that, if he did not sign an agreement with a union, she would leave him. Clara feared the conflict would turn into real violence, and that her name would be recorded in history forever as the name of the family responsible for workers' deaths. The wife's ultimatum worked where no economic, political, or moral argument had yielded results. Ford backed down. He signed an agreement with the United Automobile Workers Union, recognizing it as the representative of his workers. The last bastion of anti-union resistance in the American motor industry had fallen, and it fell through one resolute woman who simply said enough. But Clara's intervention could not halt another deeper process, the gradual disintegration of the Ford family under the weight of the patriarch himself. Relations between Henry and his only son Edsel had never been easy. Edsel was everything. Henry was not educated, refined, sociable, open to new trends. He preferred jazz to country dances, modern art to traditional crafts, elegant clubs to rural taverns. Henry considered these tastes a sign of weakness of character, and for decades treated his son with condescension, Despite the fact that Edsel had formerly been president of Ford Motor Company since 1919. Worse still, Henry publicly supported Harry Bennett against his own son, allowing the former boxer to humiliate Edsel in the full view of the entire board. This prolonged pressure took its toll on the younger Ford's health. In 1943, Edsel died at the age of 49 from stomach cancer. The immediate cause was illness, but those closest to him knew that stress inflicted by his father had been destroying him for years. The death of his only son was a blow from which the 80-year-old Henry Ford never recovered. On an initial impulse, trusting no one any longer, he decided to return himself to the position of company president, despite serious cardiac problems and an inability to carry out day-to-day work. The Ford Motor Company board received the ailing founder's decision with unease, but most directors were either too intimidated or too accustomed to yielding to his will to object. The company's results began to deteriorate sharply. The Second World War was in progress. Ford's factories were producing B-24 Liberator bombers, tanks, and military trucks, and President Franklin Roosevelt's administration seriously considered nationalizing the enterprise, deeming that the old man's chaotic management endangered the war effort. At its worst, Ford Motor Company was losing, in today's money, more than $10 million a month. The specter of bankruptcy hung over the empire that had once produced half the world's automobiles. And it was then, in September 1945, that for the second time in the family's history, two women stood before Henry Ford and backed him into a corner. Clara, his wife, and Eleanor, Edsel's widow, came to him with an ultimatum. Either he would hand management of the company to his grandson, Henry Ford II, or both would sell their shares, which together amounted to nearly 3/4 of all the family's holdings. Ford was furious. He shouted, protested, withdrew into himself. But after a few days he submitted, because he had to. He signed the documents transferring the presidency to his grandson, 28-year-old Henry II, who had only just returned from the Navy. One of the young president's first moves was to dismiss Harry Bennett. The era of brutal factory policing came to an end in a single day. Henry Ford spent the last months of his life in a manner that seems a symbolic closing of the entire story of his fate. He withdrew from company affairs, returned to Fairlane, his estate in Dearborn, and devoted his time to things that had always interested him, but which he had set aside for decades: repairing old watches, walking in the garden, reading books, talking with Clara. He founded the Greenfield Village Museum, to which he brought authentic historic buildings from across America: the Wright brothers' workshop, Thomas Edison's laboratory, the school he himself had attended as a child. In his own way, he was returning to sources, to the world before machines, to the America of the time when he himself had still been a farm boy taking apart a watch at the kitchen table. He died on April 7, 1947, at the age of 83, at his estate, Fairlane, from a cerebral hemorrhage. On the day of his death, the swollen waters of the River Rouge flooded Dearborn. The electricity failed due to the flooding, and Ford spent the final hours of his life by the light of kerosene lamps, just as in his childhood on the farm. At the funeral there appeared thousands of ordinary people who for decades had driven his cars, worked in his factories, and believed in his vision. More than 5,000 people an hour filed past the public place where his body lay in state. Henry Ford was buried not far from the factory in which the automotive revolution had been born. His legacy remained contradictory, multi-layered, and not to be reduced to a single sentence. He was an engineering genius and a despot, a visionary and a man blinded by prejudice, a philanthropist who doubled workers' wages, and a tyrant who controlled their private lives, a pacifist who made money from wars, an American patriot who collected decorations from foreign regimes. And despite all these contradictions, or perhaps because of them, he remains one of the most important figures of the 20th century. A man who took the idea of a car, destined for a handful of the wealthy, and made it accessible to millions of ordinary families. Who changed the way the world produces things. Who proved that a farm boy, undereducated, ridiculed, and thrown out of his own companies, can move the whole world from its place if only he knows in which direction it needs to be pushed. The watch he learned to take apart at the age of 12 truly turned out to be the key to everything, provided one had the patience to understand how each of its 130 parts worked. That brings our story for today to a close. Thank you very much for being with me to the very end.